Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith.
And I'm Serena Halstead. Welcome to our data-literate podcast. Just as a reminder, we are in the second season of our podcast, and our focus is on data. So far, we've interviewed education expert Rick Romelli about the topic grading practices as it relates to collecting and documenting data. Rick has provided us with a wealth of information on the purpose of grades. He has enlightened us about what should be included in a grading plan and suggested some best practices for how to balance grading policies with accountability mandates. Our interview with Rick Romelli is shared in the series Grading, Being Truly Evidentiary. Today, we are starting a new series entitled Data Literacy. This first episode focuses on what is data literacy and why we need to be data literate educators. Now I will begin with two brief definitions of the term data literacy. The first definition, the ability to read, understand, create, and explain information in a useful and meaningful way. The other definition, data literacy, is the ability to source, interpret, and communicate data in different contexts. Mellisa and Spencer, after reading this definition, I'm somewhat getting the idea that the term data literacy might take on slightly different meanings depending on different users. Mellisa and Spencer, does the definition of data literacy change for different users?
I don't think as much the definition changes as much as how you might apply those three elements. So that source, that interpret, that communicate. That if you're a teacher or a parent or an owner of a bakery, what kind of information and data you might source might vary. How you interpret it based on what your goals are might vary, and what you communicate, depending on who your stakeholders, might vary. But I think those three elements, source, interpret, and communicate, I think those are going to be accurate no matter what role you're in.
I think I agree with you, Spencer, because for me, I felt as though when you think of data as information, whether you're in the classroom or a regular citizen, it feels like data literacy is about making sense of information around us. So that'll be like the source of the information, trying to figure out what is it saying to us, which is like you're interpreting. And then can I explain it to myself or anybody else? So that's kind of like you're communicating. So I feel as though regardless of where you are or who you are or what your role is, those three skills will always be the same.
Okay, I like that. So referring back to the definition we have established about data literacy, the ability to source, interpret, and communicate data in context, we see that there are some skills or abilities that data literate individuals should have. From these, we can generate some whys for being data literate. One of the first skills is data literate individuals should be able to source data within context. Mellisa and Spencer, why is sourcing data in context important?
So I went back and forth with this one, and I'm trying to think sourcing data. I don't know if that's as important as the validity of the data, because I think when I'm in the classroom, the source of my data is most times the assessments that I give. But I always had to kind of ask myself, is my data valid? Because I don't always have control over the sources. So I'm more thinking of, is the validity of the data important? Because there's a relationship between your data and the interpretation of your data. And so to me, having valid data is a little bit more important, or a big part of finding the sourcing of the data. I don't know how to explain that, but I feel as though those two are together. When I think of sources, I think of validity.
Yeah, and so for that, I think of, there's that quote, maybe you remember who it's from, but that all data is valid. It's just kind of how you interpret and communicate it. And maybe that's where
James.
Yeah.
Popham. I think it might be him.
Yeah, and so maybe that's where that sourcing within context comes from. And there's a line in How to Share Data with Families, and we'll post that in the show notes that I liked, which talked about educators have a responsibility to place data in a developmental context to help families make sense of how their child is playing, behaving, socializing, moving, speaking, learning, and thinking. Doing so requires an understanding of child development and grade level expectations. So making sure that the data you're collecting and then therefore interpreting, therefore communicating, is in that right context. So for instance, if you have a third grader that is excelling and you want to see how they might do on a fourth grade benchmark, it's really important to be kind of considering that source and considering the context of that source when you interpret and communicate, because there wouldn't be the same expectation since they're moving a grade up. So that's how I thought of is these three skills all being kind of interwoven, but it's really important to be considerate of just what is the source of the data.
Thank you. So another skill data literate individuals should have is knowing how to interpret data correctly within context. Mellisa and Spencer, I'm going to start a statement here, and I want you to finish it, and I want you to expound a little on why interpreting data correctly is important. So I'll begin. Data without right interpretation is like, and Mellisa, I'm going with you first.
So you know me, I'm a foodie, so I always have a food. I thought of food when I saw this. And so the other day when I was working with my Girl Scouts, we were looking at spices and stuff, and we had a discussion around cayenne pepper and paprika. And so I feel as though data without the right interpretation is like adding cayenne instead of paprika on a potato salad, right?
Are you referring to the color? If you might make a mistake with the colors?
No, well, the colors are the same, but and I mean, depending on who you are and what you're looking for, what you're going for, I think most people put paprika, but I've seen that you could put cayenne. So I think the spice changes the palate, and so to the interpretation. The interpretation changes what you can do with that data and how you answer that data question. So that's how I see that simile. It all depends. Again, they can both work, but it depends on what your question is and what you're going for. That's why you need the right interpretation.
I like that. My wife was once sick and requested that I make her some milk chocolate chip cookies, and I accidentally switched the measurement needed for sugar and salts. Some people might want more salty kind of thing, but
so she got more sick.
Yeah, it's not husband year that time. But like you said, it's the same ingredients, but it ends up being something quite different than what she was hoping for.
Right.
Yeah, my analogy there was data without interpretation is like handing my toddlers a ukulele, in that it's the same instrument. In theory, the data's there, the instrument's there. It can make beautiful music, but if they don't know how to interpret it, if they don't know how to use it, then instead it's my 2-year-old chasing my cat with it. And that just handing someone data without the interpretation, without the skills for how to do so, is no better than handing an instrument to a toddler. You got to make sure that it's tuned, that they're trained, and then from that interpretation, hopefully you get some nice music out of it.
I like that you talked about the training part of it, because I know from my time in the classroom, I didn't really have, it was kind of like a learn as you go, right? And I think that in education, I feel as though I'm very good in collecting data, but using it to make different decisions is a work in progress.
Yeah, that makes me think of Yale had an infographic, 8 data points to ponder, and they had another analogy there that when we collect data without using it, it's like picking apples off the tree only to let them rot. I think that's something else. Even if you know how to interpret, even if you know how to train it, I think we sometimes just observe the data, look at it and say, oh, look at that. But if you don't actually make sense of it and act on it, then what's the point?
We are very good data admirers, I must say.
So I'm thinking some questions just coming up in mind when I'm thinking about in context, interpreting data in context. So some of the questions we'll be asking here are: am I interpreting the data correctly? And it's not just the interpretation of it. Are there any biases in my interpretation? When I say bias, it can be explicit, that this is how you see it, no matter what the data is saying, this is how you think of it. And then there's also implicit or unconscious bias that we might take to it. And so these are some questions when we're thinking about interpreting data in context. We have to, definitely put ourselves in the presence of it, but be mindful that maybe how close are we to the situation, or even lacking knowledge of the situation that led to the data. How are we interpreting it bias-free, or is it bias-free any at all? And then, is the data relevant for the decisions that we need to make? So we're trying to make some decisions about data. Are we making the right decisions based on the data that we have? Or is that data that we collect, is it relevant for the decision that needs to be made? So I'm going to go on to the next skill that data literate individuals should have. So communication. Now that we have discussed the importance of analyzing and interpreting data in context, let us talk about the importance of communicating data with different audience. Mellisa and Spencer, what are some considerations or approaches we should take in communicating data with different audiences? For example, we communicate data with teachers, students, and parents. What are some considerations that we should have in regards to this?
So I feel as though the key thing for me is to put myself in the position of the person who will be receiving the data. And again, that is something I learned over time, because if they're not able to understand the data, then, I can just present anything and just be like, okay, well, you got the data, but you can't make sense of it, right? And I found that there were times when I could give parents a report. I could spit out a report and be like, okay, well, check. I gave them and I communicated the results with them, but in my heart of hearts, I knew they had no clue. And so I feel sometimes with all of the reports that we get, they're pretty, they're colors, and they're meant to indicate and say things. But I think it's always important to kind of understand, for lack of a better phrase, the data literacy of the person receiving the data or the results when you're communicating with them.
I like that. Yeah, and for this question, the article I mentioned previously, How to Share Data with Families, I thought had a great 4-point set of items to consider when sharing data. The first being recognize that data and data sharing require responsible discretion. So being conscious of, should these people have access to this data? Keep in mind things like FERPA, making sure that you are being ethical with how you're sharing it. Second being make data accessible, understandable, and actionable. Yeah, and that kind of goes to what you were saying. And part of here is just that you don't have to share everything, be it with families or the school board, just thinking about what specifically are they asking for to make sure it is actionable. Give access and training is the third point that they make. And likewise, just figuring out what skills do they have and what skills will they need in order to make sense of this data. Making sure that's ongoing so they're able to be empowered and start making use of their own data. And then also address unique needs. So be it the language or culture or comfortability with technology or data dashboards of the recipients, whatever it might be. They had a quote in the article that it's one thing to share data, but you also need to share help too, so they feel empowered. So those were the 4 points that I thought stood out for when you're thinking about communicating data, what to consider.
I think your fourth point is one we tend to overlook, right? Especially in education, because I think we know that it's important to communicate, but I think we forget to put ourselves in the framework or the mindset of the person receiving to because, we can always get off on a tangent about using a lot of data lingo and assume that everybody is coming to the data with the same expertise. And we forget training. Like I said, when you think of parents, it doesn't have to be, you bring everybody in for an official training. But again, just making sure that the language is clear, right? Writing it, it doesn't have a whole lot of jargon in it, that it has layman terms, that all key aspects of it are explained, that sort of thing. And like you said, it's actionable. Like you're telling parents, not just hello, here's what's going on, but what can you do differently to help your kids? So I think that's really key. I like that.
So going back to that last bit that Spencer shared, and you're mentioning here, Mellisa, to be actionable. Mm-hmm. So it makes me want to go back and look at the definition again. So like I said, it's a simple definition of data literacy, mm-hmm. But we mentioned we should be able to source, interpret, communicate data in context. But I'm hearing this fourth piece that is saying make it become actionable. So you're giving persons more so not just the data, but giving them some advice as to what to do with it. So at this point in time, I am going to shift focus a little and let's go back a little to the classroom situation. So you mentioned, Mellisa, giving parents the reports. We might, for example, give a report in reading saying that your student is struggling with letter sounds, but then that information, what else should we want parents to do with that? So you're saying then that data literate educators or data literate individuals, doesn't have to be an educator now, but data literate individuals, they should be knowledgeable about the data to provide persons receiving it some information that they can act on it, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, because I mean, okay, so I like your example, right? So if we go with, here's how your child is doing on letter sounds. I mean, letter sounds, I mean, that might sound like really simple, but for some parents, like, I have no clue what that means. Like, so he can sound letters. I mean, how in depth do you go? Do we provide an explanation of what that is like? There is a responsibility, I guess, to data literate educators or anybody who's considering themselves data literate to make sure that when they're communicating, that you understand just as much as I'm understanding. There is a duality, I guess, in this data literacy, as with any type of literacy, I guess.
And even better if you can pull it off, to train your students, to train your parents, to train your school board so that they have access to the data that they need and the skills so that they can start answering some of these questions without being kind of told from us. And so if we can empower those users so that they have the data they need and they have the skills that they require to interpret it, I think that's going to be best bet.
Or even I like that empowerment word, or even the ability to say, "Hey, I don't understand this." Right? Yeah. I think that's an empowerment level to say, "Hey, you just gave me this, and I have no clue what this says." Like that is a level of empowerment to know that I can even say or articulate that I don't understand when I don't understand.
Yeah. So I'm also hearing too that give them the information to act on it, but you, the data literate individual, must have some knowledge about that data. So you remember, I remember one time, Mellisa, we were doing something with a parent report, and we were supposed to come up with some ideas as to what parents were supposed to do, how to help them at home. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then being data literate, even if you don't know all the information that, where parents or, who are you communicating with can act on it, at least be able to point them into some directions as to where they can go to get further information on what to do with this data, right?
Right. And giving them permission to ask.
Yeah. Yes.
I feel as though a lot of times we present data in a way as that's like, this is the be all, and people don't feel comfortable to say, hey, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what you're saying about this.
Yeah. Or are we really, remember when as teachers, we first started using technology and it showed up in the teacher standards. And it was, you need to use technology. So your AP or someone would walk in your room, and then as a teacher, you just be like, there's a laptop here, check it off.
Laptop, Spencer. I mean, it was the overhead projector was like, woo!
Yeah. And the fact is, it was just the presence, as if it's just something you're supposed to check off instead of how is this actually transforming, instructing and learning. I think same thing with data. Sometimes we just talk about it as if it's something that you're supposed to do so you can check it off instead of creating the systems and processes and cultures where we all discuss data because it drives instruction and learning forward.
I read where they say we have a tendency to interact with data as though data of itself is the agent, and it's not information for an agent. Mm-hmm. And so, like I said, I think we owe ourselves, we are responsible for others, just like with math literacy, numeracy, any of those things. I make sure that you understand and you make sure that I understand. I think there's a dual responsibility that we have.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic has really shed a lot of light on that. Whereas it forced us, hopefully it will force us out of this dichotomy of data is the agent and tells us everything, or data just tells us nothing. I worry we might go to the other end, but instead ending up with that relationship there. That is our responsibility to think about what data are we sourcing so we have the right information to the questions we're asking. How do we interpret to figure out just what it does and does not tell us, and then how should we communicate that responsibly so that we are telling the right story.
So now that we have covered what is data literacy, why it is important to be data literate, Mellisa and Spencer, consider giving the why from maybe perhaps a teacher or a school administrator perspective.
Well, as cliche it may sound, making database decisions is at the heart of teaching and learning. And so that every move a teacher, a student, a parent, a custodian, a principal, a nurse makes is based on information or data to answer a question that they have in mind, right? So as a student, you'll be like, well, should I write down what the teacher just said? Or as a teacher, should I introduce a new topic? Or as a parent, should I get my child a tutor? The custodian could be asking, should I try a new detergent? Principal, should I encourage teachers to listen to the data-lit podcast? The answer is yes. Should I support, reducing the number of new initiatives? No matter, there's always a question, and you need data and information to answer that. So no matter who you are, every day you're faced with making decisions and needing sound data to make those decisions. So as citizens, it is important that we all are skilled in knowing where to find that data, how to make sense of that data, and then how to act appropriately based on the data.
Oh, I like that. I think that it's extra important because I think being data literate can help us counteract our biases. Because yes, we're always making decisions, but the fact is that our brains operate on auto drive as often as possible. We're not naturally constantly analyzing every piece of information that comes across our way. That's why my toddlers are more distractible. They haven't figured out how to kind of tune in that auto drive yet. They're still learning that. But even though that makes me perhaps less distractible than my 5-year-old, it also means that there's a lot of data that I'm just overlooking in order to put my brain on auto drive. So I think being data literate can force me to pause and actually look at what is the information in front of me. What information should I gather? What should I interpret? How should I communicate it? Instead of just letting my assumptions and preconceived notions and everything that allows my brain just to kind of skate by to paint in parts of the picture that might not actually be there. So that for me is why it's important to be data literate.
Thank you, Mellisa and Spencer. And for me, being data literate enables us to use data effectively in making important decisions. Decisions regarding business actions and outcomes in schools. Decisions for investing in a new program. Retaining or promoting students to the next grade level, or determining whether schools have met pre-established goals. By being data literate, we're able to make sound decisions based on facts. We can also explore and experiment with data to uncover new insights and opportunities. For our next episode, we will look at types of data, followed by how to talk about data and how to overcome data-related obstacles. In the second half of our series, we will continue with our interviews. Music for this episode is provided by Cary High School, Logan Foster. Thank you. If you have any questions, comments, or further notes for us, you can reach us at www.wcpss.net/datalit. Thank you. Goodbye.